American soldiers captured in the Cold War. The enemy needs them as hostages and bargaining counters. Their own government denies their existence, leaving them to their fate. For years, it was an open wound for thousands of families in the United States. The search for forgotten prisoners in the Vietnamese jungle. The boys who were left behind. The boys who scratched these codes in the earth in desperate attempts to make contact with home. Attempts their own government ignored. Moscow, 1993. The Cold War is over. Russian President Boris Yeltsin opens the Soviet Union's secret archives to Western historians. In the files of Soviet military intelligence, Australian historian Stephen Morris finds a report of a speech made by North Vietnamese General Tran Van Quang.
And I come across this document which is actually dealing with a number of different issues. And there at the end is a big section on POWs. And I start reading through it, and they're talking about 1,205. We are holding 1,205 American prisoners of war, but we've only told the Americans we're holding 368.
Morris realizes the explosive potential of the report. He makes a copy and smuggles it to the USA. The US has a new president. Bill Clinton wants to improve relations with Vietnam 20 years after the conflict. What Morris has discovered is sensitive information.
Congratulations.
Morris gives the document to the administration and asks them to keep it confidential. The reaction is immediate.
All of the people in the intelligence agencies of the United States were like brought to life in a most unbelievable way. All of a sudden there are investigations going on of me. People who I knew where I worked were being called to ask about him. You know, who is paying this guy? You know, who, do you know? I mean, my friend who was working at at the University of California in Berkeley was called by somebody from State Department Intelligence Bureau to ask who was paying Stephen Morris over these years. This is the kind of reaction I got from the intelligence community.
Morris releases the document to the newspapers. But then the US military announces it must be a forgery because it conflicts with information held by the secret services. President Clinton's administration remains true to America's proud Cold War claim. Nobody gets left behind. Or if they are, deny it. It's a policy that began as early as World War I. The US entered the war reluctantly in 1917, but it proved crucial in defeating Germany after 4 years of carnage. In Russia, Lenin's October Revolution broke out that same year. In 1918, the Western Allies sent troops to Russia to defeat the communist Bolsheviks. 13,000 US soldiers landed at Archangel and Vladivostok. The revolutionaries have toppled the Tsar, but they don't yet control the country. In the brutal campaign that follows, American forces fight with White Russians against the communist Red Army. The chief instigator of the Allied campaign is Britain's War Minister, Winston Churchill. He insists that Bolshevism must be strangled in its cradle. But the campaign is a failure. In the fighting, the Bolsheviks take American prisoners, about 60 officers and men. The American public learn nothing of this. But the fate of the prisoners is recorded in both Soviet and American military files.
The policy response of the United States government to the secretly held prisoners in Russia of 1919 basically was to declare them dead.
The reason? The Soviets mean to use the prisoners to pressure the USA into recognizing the Soviet Union. America has no intention of being blackmailed by Lenin. In Washington, the men are declared dead. If there are no hostages, there's no problem. Lenin dies in 1924. 10 years later, his successor Stalin achieves his aim. America's President Roosevelt recognizes the Soviet Union. Because in Europe, things have changed. Hitler has come to power in Germany. The Nazi state is a potential threat to both America and Russia. A common front against Hitler is more important than the small matter of 60 or 70 prisoners. They must not be allowed to stand in the way of the new relationship. The men left behind slave in Soviet work camps until their death. Their files in the US are classified top secret until the 1990s. World War II. The next chapter of the story opens with the Allied bombing offensive over Germany. More than 28,000 American flyers are shot down and taken prisoner in a 2-year campaign. But by the end of 1944, Allied forces are advancing onto German soil, from the west and from the east. Camps holding a total of more than 300,000 US and British prisoners are liberated by the British and Americans in the west, by the Soviets in the east. But the friendship between Eastern and Western allies soon shows signs of cracks. The freed American and British troops are not being allowed to return to their own zones. Stalin insists on ferrying them to the east. He says they'll be sent home by ship from the Black Sea port of Odessa. But it doesn't turn out that way.
We uncovered documentary evidence that out of over 5,000 Americans overrun by the Russians just in Poland alone, that only 2,000 some were repatriated from Odessa. So there were 3,000 immediately missing who were sent east into Russia from Poland. That was the first big number of Americans. And there was a comparable number of British and French also sent east at that time.
It appears that the Soviets are moving Allied troops eastwards with their German prisoners of war. They seem to be treating their allies like enemies. The Western powers begin urgent consultations about the appropriate response. Britain's Field Marshal Harold Alexander is particularly worried. He wants to inform the world's press. He believes that more than 20,000 British and American soldiers are being held by the Soviets. The victors are supposed to have free access to all prisoner of war camps. But Stalin lets the Americans inspect only one camp in his territory. All the others are closed to the Western Allies. A few US generals take matters into their own hands. They send American planes to pick up the prisoners without telling the Soviets. The first commando raid takes the Soviet guards by surprise. But when they try to repeat it, the Soviets block the runways. American and British spy planes fly over the Soviet zone looking for signs of Allied prisoners in old German POW camps. In the town of Luckenwalde, they find several thousand British and American soldiers held by the Soviets. The column of trucks they send to pick them up is turned back by gunfire. Soviet fighters are sent up to intercept the spy planes. Even before their final victory over Germany, Soviets and Americans are shooting each other down in dogfights above the conquered land. All this is kept quiet. The American prisoners know that every passing day makes their situation worse. Many escape on their own, finding their own way back to American lines. Some seek refuge in Dresden, in a villa flying the Stars and Stripes. It belongs to an American family, the Nobles. They stayed in Dresden during the war to take care of their camera factory, heavily restricted by the Nazis, but never imprisoned. Now they wait with the escaped GIs for the Americans to come.
The first I heard about it was a week before I was arrested. American soldiers were on their way to Dresden to pick up the POWs who had come to us. That's when I heard that 225 or 250 of the American POWs in Dresden had been arrested and taken away by the Soviets.
Soon afterwards, the Nobles too are arrested, without knowing why.
As they entered the prison, they said, "Don't expect justice. There's no justice here. You're the prisoners, we're the victors, and we can do whatever we want." And my father said, "We're Americans, you can't do whatever you want." "Oh, yes, we can."
The Nobles are deported to Siberia, together with other American soldiers freed from German prison camps. In 1945, thousands of US citizens are carted off to the Soviet Union to be used as Cold War hostages. There's evidence of them in US military files. And in the accounts of Soviet camp survivors.
We stopped for morning roll call when the work brigades were divided up. Someone said to me, "See those three over there? Those are American pilots." And one of them was black.
Years of forced labor as pawns in a game played out between the superpowers. The Kremlin once again plans to use prisoners as bargaining counters in negotiations with the West. But the Allies refuse to make any territorial or financial concessions. So they used as slave labor to rebuild the Soviet Union ravaged by war. Allied prisoners are mixed in with Soviet citizens.
I was in Camp 3 first. There were 4,500 of us. And about 10% of those, about 400 people, were foreigners.
German POWs in the Gulag were allowed to write home via the Red Cross. John Noble managed to get hold of a postcard. He addressed it to relatives in West Germany. They got in touch with the American media, and the resulting pressure succeeded in freeing Noble from the camp. In 1955, he and another American arrived in Berlin.
Both Marchuk and John H. Noble here were in red slave labor camps. Noble from Detroit was arrested with his German-born father in Dresden in 1945. They refused to take down a U.S. flag flying from their home. His father was released in 1952. Now freedom for 31-year-old John Noble.
At the Berlin press conference, they told me not to talk about the other Americans still held in Russia. Well, I really began to yell. I said, "No way. You want me to hold a press conference and not say anything about the Americans?" But that's exactly what the world ought to hear about. What's going on over there? And they said, "Yes, of course, we want that too, but first we have to find out exactly who they are. Because everyone will be asking us, what are you doing for the Americans over there?"
The urgent inquiries the Americans say they want to make are just a smokescreen. They already have all the information they need from their own intelligence services and via the Red Cross in Geneva. The Red Cross know exactly how many Americans are missing in the Soviet occupation zone. They have all the German records from the prison camps, and they're meticulously accurate. But the Red Cross refused to release any information about the missing POWs.
We know for a fact to this day there exists a whole body of records in the Red Cross, in the International Red Cross, about the American prisoners of war of World War II, Americans, British, and French, and others. And those records have remained classified to this day, and we have never been allowed access to all the records we want.
Is the Red Cross stonewalling under pressure from Western governments? What is certain is that Alan Dulles, US Secret Service chief in Switzerland, sees many of the reports that go to and from the Red Cross in Geneva. In 1953, Dulles becomes head of the CIA and thus shares the responsibility for any cover-up over the missing soldiers. Decades later, declassified Pentagon files make it clear just how closely the US kept tabs on the missing prisoners. But in public, America stays silent to discourage Soviet blackmail attempts. Stalin wants billions of dollars in aid for reconstruction and a free hand in Eastern Europe. And he badly wants the return of all Soviet citizens still sheltering in the West. Those who fled after the 1917 revolution, who were in a German prisoner of war camp or were slave laborers for the Germans, are all tainted. They will face the Gulag or death if they return. One of the most shocking incidents took place in 1945 in the Austrian town of Linz. 20,000 Cossacks, men, women and children, were held there. They had fought for Hitler during the war, and they trusted a British promise not to hand them over to the Soviets. When the British break their promise, hundreds of Cossacks commit suicide. Few of those handed over to the Red Army are still alive at the end of 1945. The Potsdam Conference that year had deliberately ignored the subject of missing or abducted prisoners. The victors were playing global power politics. The fate of individuals, of tens of thousands of people, could be overlooked. In 1950, the growing conflict between East and West breaks out into full-scale war. On one side, the United States and her allies. On the other, Communist North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union. More American prisoners join the US servicemen held behind the Iron Curtain. 8,000 more. 21-year-old Corporal Ronald Van Wees is one of them. On the 8th of December 1952, his father learns that his son is missing. It's days before he can tell his wife.
That was very hard. I never seen so much crying in my life.
Rita Van Wees, Ronald's mother, can't come to terms with her son's disappearance. She starts writing letters to world leaders to ask for their help.
My dad, he went to work in the morning with a handful, sometimes 20 letters, handwritten letters.
Rita Van Wees will campaign for more than 7 years. She receives answers from presidential candidates who promise to investigate Ronald's case if they're elected, and from minor officials in foreign countries who can do no more than wish her luck in her search. And then, a ray of hope. In a magazine, she finds a North Korean propaganda photo. And she sees her son. He's alive. This is film footage of the same event. Rita Van Wees appeals to her government. The response is sobering.
The most thing that they told the parents, and they told my mother, who they told the wrong one, is, do you want us to have another war because of your son?
Rita Van Wees and her daughter Lillian are invited to Washington. An officer wants to speak to them.
One of the first things he told her was, Mrs. Van Wees, wouldn't you think it would be better if you believed your son to be dead? And my mother said, no. And he said, well, it really would be better if you thought that way. And he said, then you could get on with your life. And he said, there's no evidence that he's alive. And my mother, which she kind of shocked me because she's a nice and quiet, really lady, she leaned over the desk, she took him by the lapel, and she said to me, there's no evidence that he's dead. Besides, I don't have any evidence, I have a government.
A group of mothers demonstrate in front of the White House, demanding information about their sons. Rita Van Wees tries to force the military to give her answers. She accuses President Eisenhower in court of doing nothing to free the prisoners. Her lawsuit makes the headlines.
She presented that whole case before that judge, and he put his head down and looked up at her, and he said, what do you want me to do? I have no jurisdiction over the president. So then she asked him, well, who does? You know, and he says, I don't. So she says, well, do we have to go before the courts of God to get an answer what happened to our loved ones?
The prosecution fails. But then Rita Van Wees hears from an organization of Russian exiles. Nicholas Shaykin is a Cossack living with his wife in Athens, Greece. He has more than enough reason to hate the Soviet regime. He promises to help Rita find out if her son is being held in Siberia. He asks for a foolproof way of identifying Ron.
We had words, like that sometimes in your family you have a little word and only your family knows about. Well, this word went over there, and his reaction to it, what he said, and we knew that he was telling the truth.
In 1959, Ron is spotted as a tractor driver near Krasnoyarsk. The North Koreans have handed him over to the Russians. But then contact is lost. Nicholas Shaykin is wanted by the KGB. He fakes his own death. Rita Van Wees never hears from him again. But then she starts to receive sinister phone calls.
I heard her saying on the phone to whoever she was speaking to, tell me what you want, come up here, have a cup of coffee, I'll give you cookies, I'll make you a sandwich, you want something to eat, and I'll explain to you why I've been doing this all these years. Then if you want to kill me, she says, then go ahead. And I'm looking, what in the world? And then we hung up, and she hung up, and she said, oh, she says, I don't know what I'm going to do. So then she told me, oh, this is about the 6th time. And I didn't know it, but that's when I heard. And my father said, yeah, they threatened her life a couple of times. Who they are, I don't know.
One day when the family is out shopping, someone breaks in. They don't touch cash or jewelry, but all the documents about Ron are taken. All they miss is a small box of letters.
Those drawers were gone, and that was a heartbreak. She just sat down and cried. She said, why? Why?
Rita Van Wees kept on searching for her son until the day she died. He's still officially posted missing. One of 8,000 who survived capture in Korea, but never came home. In 1992, Congress investigated what happened to the Korean War prisoners.
You swear each and individually that you will...
The Senate Select Committee interviewed all the surviving officials from that period. One of them was the man who supplied intelligence about prisoners of war to President Eisenhower, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso.
Full text will be placed in the record.
The committee was chaired by Senators John Kerry, Bob Smith, and John McCain.
Colonel Corso, do you want to lead off?
I walked in the office, and the president was in the Oval Office. He said, I understand you have a report on prisoners of war going to the Soviet Union. I told him, yes, that's what I'm here for. So I compiled this report, not only here, but information in Korea, which I said before, that close to 1,200 that we suspect, but about 900 certain that did go there. Our information is solid as intelligence information can be, because that's the nature of intelligence. These men will never come back alive, because they will get in the hands of the KGB, who will use them for their purposes, espionage, playbacks, or whatever. And I told Mr. President, you're aware of the system of the KGB, how they use prisoners of war and defectors. And he said, yes, I am. He said, is your recommendation not to make it public? I told him, my recommendation not to make public the KGB operation. It's difficult to understand at its best. It hasn't been revealed. The part on our prisoners, I told him, that I don't know. So the president said, well, I accept your recommendation. He said, why do you believe we shouldn't make them? I told him, well, it had an effect on the families, and they're going to know what happened to these boys, and naturally it'll come up the discussion of the KGB. How does this operation operate? And he says, well, I agree, we can't give it to the families. But our policy sort of tied our hands on this. U.S. policy tied our hands.
Colonel, I did not know General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower personally. I do know many, 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 many people who knew him. And for me to assume that he would say to 1,200 families, I'm sorry, but we're not going to tell you anything about the fact that your loved ones may be alive, strains my imagination, and I appreciate your testimony.
Sir,
12 years after Korea, history seems to be repeating itself in Vietnam. US forces are again fighting communists from the north, supported by Moscow and Peking. Once more, the US is afraid of the domino effect. If Vietnam falls to the communists, other countries will follow. That's the theory. 3 times as many bombs fall on Vietnam as in the entire Second World War. The US never declares war on North Vietnam, with fatal consequences for captured American servicemen. American pilots are not considered soldiers, but bandits. Everyone, even the children, learns what to do if they meet an American pilot.
Cho nên những cái tiếng này chúng ta học thuộc để đề phòng nếu có giặc Mỹ lại máy bay hoặc là những cái mà lại lút vào địa phương của chúng ta để chúng ta tiếp tục ta phải học thêm 2 tiếng. Hành động là giơ tay lên, bảo nó phải giơ tay lên, nó phải giơ tay lên như thế này. Vì sao mà phải giơ tay lên như vậy? Ta đề phòng nó có những cái vũ khí bí mật ở trong bản thân của nó ta không hiểu được. Hands up,
Hands up and be still. The first English phrases many Vietnamese children learn. They mustn't shoot unless it's absolutely necessary. There must be no lynching. The Vietnamese know how valuable enemy prisoners can be, and not just for propaganda purposes. Western pilots can provide a lot of important information, especially the men who fly the F-111, the world's first swing-wing bomber. When a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft team brings down an F-111, the crew face the same fate as the first jet pilots in the Korean War.
Moscow bound came from Korea. It was a Korean War term, primarily because of the F-86 pilots. It was a lousy aircraft they were flying against the MiG because the MiG was faster, but how did we whip it? With tactics and training. That is a quantum leap. That's what the Russians wanted, that's what the Chinese wanted. That's why they wound up in Vorkuta, that's why they wound up in Kiev, or that's why they wound up in Sverdlovsk or Novosibirsk at the factories and plants. They wanted them.
Now the Soviets want American technology. F-111s become the big target of the air war. Only one shot-down F-111 crew will make it back to the US after the war. All the others simply disappear.
They were shooting down these aircraft, and people with all this knowledge were coming down like manna from Lenin. They were freebies. And that term came out of Korea. They were freebies. You didn't have to send an agent in to penetrate CIA or NSA or DIA or McDonnell Douglas or IBM. These people came floating down into the hands of your ally, the North Vietnamese.
The US military go to great lengths to rescue downed aircrew. Their knowledge must not fall into enemy hands. The rescuers in their helicopters are very vulnerable. It's often a life and death mission. But nobody gets left behind. This is especially true of the bomber pilots. As long as they have not been taken prisoner. On the 18th of May 1965, David Rydlichka takes off in his F-105 fighter bomber. His target is in Laos, across the border from Vietnam. This war is a CIA secret operation. Officially, Rydlichka's mission doesn't exist. His plane is shot down. Rydlichka ejects. His colleagues circle above as he lands safely, but is taken prisoner by local villagers. The war in Laos must stay secret. Rydlichka is a prisoner, but the US can't admit it. His wife Carol and their 3 children learn that he's missing.
They told me in the very beginning was, you don't talk about this. This is a secret war in Laos. You don't talk about it, and you don't say anything about your husband because you might get him killed. So that was what they told me right off the bat, to keep my mouth shut.
Carol Rydlichka is invited to a photo session with her children. The picture is to be used for identification if contact is made with her husband. Then a photo appears in the Soviet newspaper Pravda, proof that David Rydlichka is alive. The Pentagon have known that for a long time. But information about the fate of downed airmen is top secret.
Over 90% of American POWs lost in Vietnam, we knew exactly what happened to them and what enemy unit would have the information. We knew it, and we had it listed.
Spy planes are airborne day and night over North Vietnam. They record radio, telephone, and even telex communications.
Now, when I was a cryptanalyst, I got the codes, and my job was to break the codes.
The NSA decodes thousands of reports about American prisoners in Vietnam. They know there will soon be a use for all this data. The White House wants to end the war. The president's team will need names and ranks, numbers and locations to negotiate the return of all the prisoners.
I called down to the Pentagon and said, we have all these lists. Do you want them? And take them over to the State Department. No, we have something better, was the exact quote. You know, I don't know what they had that was better than knowing exact North Vietnamese units that had shot down our people and had the exact details of what happened to them, but they said they had something better.
1973. The peace talks in Paris come to an end. Officially, the question of the prisoners is resolved too.
In 1973, the Air Force brings home its prisoners of war. At last, they return to freedom after years of painful captivity.
The homecoming is a carefully choreographed media event. But many families wait in vain, like the Rydlichkas. Not a single prisoner comes home from Laos.
Thank you. Hi.
But that doesn't stop President Nixon taking the credit for a mission accomplished.
The year 1972, moving into 1973 in January, saw the return of all Americans from Vietnam, all of our combat forces, the return of all of our prisoners of war.
A day or so after that, the Defense Department official who was responsible for POW-MIA matters, a man named Shields, Dr. Shields, reported to the acting Secretary of Defense, Mr. Clemens of Texas. He said, Mr. Clemens, the President said they're all home, and I must tell you, they're not all home. There are still a number of them. I think the figure was 55 or something like that, that we know for sure were in North Vietnamese prisons that we didn't get back. And the Secretary told him in words to the effect, Dr. Shields, you didn't hear the President, I guess. He said they're all home. Mr. Shields, they're all home.
The administration is keeping quiet about a serious failure in the negotiations. America had promised the North Vietnamese billions of dollars to rebuild their country. In exchange, all the American prisoners were to be freed. But Congress refused to approve the funds. Not a single cent for a regime that had tortured Americans. When Nixon agreed to more than $3 billion for reconstruction, as well as $1.5 billion for food, he might have guessed that unless it was paid, the prisoners would not all come home. But the president is in a tough situation. Watergate is already making headlines. He badly needs Vietnam to be a success.
If this pledge was made, then why wouldn't the Vietnamese hold back some prisoners? Because they need some collateral. They had no collateral. If you give everybody up and you're being offered $4.3 billion, what collateral do you hold? And so it's very possible that the Vietnamese more likely not only possible, probable, that the Vietnamese withheld that information, held back prisoners pending the 4.3.
Nixon's broken promise doesn't become public until 1977. Meanwhile, the Pentagon maintains its silence about the prisoners and ensures that according to the files, there are no survivors.
They called me and they said, well, we're going to have this hearing, and do you want to come? I said, well, if I come down there, what can I do? They said, well, nothing, because we're going to find him dead unless you have information to prove otherwise. I said, me? I said, I don't have any information. I said, I don't have any access to any intelligence. How can I have any information? I said, you guys are the ones that have all the information. And they said, well, we're declaring him dead. And I said, well, you can declare him dead, but that doesn't make him dead. And that's what they did.
Missing in action, body not recovered. That's the official phrase. His name is on the memorial wall for the fallen of the Vietnam War.
On Memorial Day and POW Recognition Day and all this, we go down and appropriately cry and we rub our hands over the wall and we say, all these poor people. But they don't listen to that wall. When I go down to that wall, what I hear is I hear voices coming from that wall that says, what the hell am I doing here? Why am I dead? Who's responsible for it? Other voices saying, hey, I'm not dead. What the hell am I doing on this wall? That's what I hear when I go down there. But the rest of them hear this, oh, it's such a sad thing. Let's all mourn these heroes. Now, if we want to keep them heroes, we better not find any live ones. Because maybe they've assimilated and now are Russian citizens. Maybe they have lineage, children. Maybe they have engaged in activities which we would consider prejudicial to the interests of the United States. Then they wouldn't be heroes anymore, would they? We'd have to take their name off the wall, and we'd have all kinds of blank spots on the wall, and how do we explain that to the American people?
Until the end of the Cold War, there was no need to explain anything. The files were kept securely under lock and key. But then, Russian President Boris Yeltsin breaks the silence. His sensational revelations shock America.
There have been many rumors for years in the United States that American POWs from the Vietnam War were transferred from Vietnam to the Soviet Union. Do you know that to have been true? And if so, are any of those men still living?
Our archives have shown that this is true. Some of them were transferred to the former Soviet Union and were kept in labor camps. We don't have complete data and can only surmise that some of them may still be alive. That is why our investigations are continuing. Some of them may have ended up in psychiatric asylums.
So it is possible some of these men may still be alive and could be returned to the United States?
Yes, it is possible.
Can we be sure Yeltsin meant what he said?
Well, he repeated it throughout much of the day today in Washington, and because what he said was so explosive and unexpected, we actually had another translator take a look at the question that I had asked to make sure there was not a problem in translation, and he said there was not, that the references specifically to Vietnam were clear, they were there, and that's what the president responded to.
And in talking about it today, Yeltsin seems to be committed to following the investigation through.
That's what he says.
Very good, Stone.
The USA and Russia formed a joint commission to investigate, but in 10 years, it got nowhere. Maybe because at the same time, in 1993, US President Bill Clinton decides to open trade relations with Vietnam, 20 years after the war. It's a popular move. With Europe and Japan as the main competition, this is no time to rake over old issues. And oil has been discovered in Vietnam. There is just one last chance to find the missing pilots. Every US pilot in Vietnam was given a 4-figure number that only he knew and that was stored in the Pentagon. And there were a series of agreed symbols. A K meant, "I'm on the run." If a pilot was shot down, he was told to scrape these signs into the ground so that they could be seen from the air and by satellites. The analysts searched for these symbols, and they found them as late as the 1990s. Senator Smith, co-chair of the Senate committee, wanted to trace a particular pilot.
We received information from a source. I had my own sources in the intelligence community. I had a few, and they didn't like it. They always tried to find out who they were so they could fire them, but they could never find out who they were. But I was told by a source of mine that there's an identifier number on a map, on a satellite imagery, post-73, that identified Peter Mathis. So I wanted to see it. So I raised hell, to be honest about it, to get in to see this intelligence imagery, because they don't show that to too many people, including U.S. senators.
Bob Smith didn't go alone. He took a photo analyst with him who had previously worked in the same department.
We pull out the imagery, and here is a map of this particular area, and there's a number there. I'll make it up, I'll just make one up, 2764. And it's written on the ground with assorted stones and sticks and grass and so forth. Very clear to me. Was it like crystal clear? No. Was it clear? Was it readable? Yes. I said there's a 2, there's a 7, there's a 6, there's a 4. So I didn't say a word. I just looked at it. I turned to the gentleman that I'd hired to come in as an independent to look at it, who worked for there. I said, "What do you see?" He said, 2, 7, 6, 4. So then I bring the other guy who's in there, who's one of the intelligence folks, and I said, "Well, doesn't that resolve it? Is that 2764 or not?" He says, "I don't see anything." I said, "Wait a minute, repeat that again." "I don't see a thing." Well, the gentleman who had hired to come in as an independent consultant was astonished. He was arguing with him. He said, "What? You don't see 2764 on that? Are you telling me you don't see that?" He said, "No, I don't see it at all. Don't see it."
These pictures have been enhanced. The real photos are still secret. These documents are from the 1980s and 90s. The Pentagon says they're irrelevant, tricks of nature, or the work of Vietnamese children. No one has explained how nature or Vietnamese children got hold of the codes of missing pilots. Officially, the Senate committee had the last word. Maybe a few Americans were left behind, and that's all. It's time to forget. But some people are still angry.
First and most obviously, the prisoners who were left behind have been cheated, badly betrayed, I would say, betrayed. Not in a legal sense necessarily, but in a moral sense. They've been betrayed. The families of these people who are American citizens have been betrayed.
We didn't like the idea of saying, well, my government knew and covered up something that was so heartbreaking, and these parents, their precious loved ones are not coming home because somebody says, "No, you're not coming home. We can't negotiate, or we don't want to." You know, it's very unfair.
What remains is 90 years of realpolitik. A reminder that national interest so easily leads to a disregard for human rights, even in the free democracies of the West.